Lucas Harper, a wealthy and self-assured businessman, had always thrived on competition. Winning was second nature to him, both in his professional life and personal endeavors. At an opulent gala in the heart of Manhattan, he was surrounded by glittering chandeliers and murmurs of high society when his close friend Ethan Blake issued a challenge that would alter the course of his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Ethan, always the provocateur, leaned back against the bar with a sly grin. His voice carried over the hum of the party. "Lucas, let's see if you've got the guts for this one. I bet you wouldn't dare marry a woman who's completely outside your type." Lucas, known for his taste in women who epitomized conventional beauty and elegance, raised an eyebrow. The challenge piqued his competitive streak. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing. "And what's the prize?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Ethan swirled his champagne lazily, his grin widening. "$1 million, he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "But there's a catch. You have to marry her and stay married for at least 6 months. Think you can handle it?" The room seemed to hush in Lucas's mind, the stakes sparking his ego. $1 million was a drop in the ocean for him, but the challenge itself, the idea of proving Ethan wrong, was irresistible. "Deal," Lucas said without hesitation, his tone firm and unyielding. Ethan's smirk deepened, as though he'd already won something. The woman Ethan had in mind was Nora Bennett, a strong, confident woman who shattered Lucas's preconceived notions of what he considered his type. She was independent, unapologetically authentic, and completely uninterested in the world of wealth and luxury Lucas inhabited. To Lucas, she was a mystery, and an opportunity to assert his dominance in this strange new game. A few days later, Lucas received more details about Nora. She wasn't someone who cared about fitting into society's mold of beauty or propriety. Her fierce independence and refusal to conform intrigued Lucas more than he cared to admit. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a puzzle to solve. Their first meeting was arranged at a high-end restaurant where crystal glasses gleamed under soft golden light. Lucas arrived early, his sharp suit and calm demeanor exuding control. When Nora stepped in, her presence filled the room without effort. She wasn't dressed to impress by high society standards, but there was something magnetic about her confidence. She walked with her head held high, her gaze unflinching. She approached the table and met his eyes without hesitation. "You must be Lucas Harper," she said, in a tone that was both direct and self-assured, as she slid into her seat. "And you must be Nora Bennett," Lucas replied smoothly, his lips curving into a controlled smile as he extended a hand. Nora glanced at his outstretched hand for a moment, before clasping it in a firm, purposeful shake. "Let's not waste time with pretenses," she said, her grip matching her gaze. Steady and strong. Lucas was momentarily taken aback by her composure. He was used to people trying to impress him, but Nora didn't seem the least bit fazed by his wealth or status. For the first time in years, Lucas felt slightly off balance, and he wasn't sure if he liked it or if he was intrigued enough to keep going. Nora began with a direct tone, her voice unwavering. "I know why we're here. I know about the bet, the terms, the conditions, all of it." Lucas was momentarily surprised by her bluntness, but he concealed it behind his usual composed demeanor. "And yet, you still agreed to meet me," he said, his curiosity piqued. "Why?" Nora paused, her sharp eyes studying him for a moment before answering. "Let's just say I have my reasons. I'm not naive, Lucas. 6 months might seem short to you, but a lot can happen in that time. If you think you can manipulate or control me, you're sorely mistaken." Her unwavering confidence made Lucas smile, though he was careful to keep it subtle. She wasn't just different. She was challenging him in ways he hadn't expected. It was refreshing and infuriating all at once, and to his surprise, it intrigued him. As their first meeting ended, Lucas found himself lingering on her words and the way she carried herself. She wasn't intimidated by him, by his wealth, or by the strange circumstances of their arrangement. In fact, she seemed utterly unfazed, which only deepened his curiosity. For perhaps the first time in years, Lucas felt admiration for someone who didn't fawn over him. Days passed, and Nora remained on his mind more than he cared to admit. Lucas was used to controlling the board in every game he played, but this time it felt as though Nora had her own pieces to move, and she was playing with a strategy he couldn't predict. Their next meeting took place in a modest cafe, a stark contrast to the opulent restaurants Lucas typically favored. The suggestion had been Nora's, and Lucas, still eager to understand her better, had agreed. He arrived dressed impeccably as always, his tailored suit making him stand out against the simplicity of the cafe's decor. When Lucas stepped inside, he spotted Nora seated at a small table near the window. She was already there, sipping tea with a calm smile, as though she had all the time in the world. There was a warmth to her greeting, a stark departure from the guarded tone of their first encounter, but her confidence was as steady as ever. "I thought you preferred 5-star restaurants," Nora teased lightly as Lucas took a seat across from her. "Sometimes it's good to break the routine," he replied, trying to sound casual, though he couldn't ignore how out of his element he felt. Their conversation started with polite small talk, details about their day, innocuous comments about the weather, but it didn't take long for Nora to steer things toward the heart of the matter. She placed her teacup down, her gaze meeting his with unwavering focus. "If we're really going through with this," she began, her voice firm but calm, "I want to make a few things clear. I'm not interested in your money or your luxurious lifestyle." Lucas leaned back slightly, intrigued by her directness. "Then what are you interested in?" he asked, folding his hands together on the table. Nora didn't hesitate. "I agree to this because it serves a purpose for me, just like it does for you. But let's not pretend this is something it's not. I'm not going to become some accessory to your life, and I won't let you treat this as just another one of your deals." For a moment, Lucas said nothing, caught off guard by her candor. He was used to people either trying to please him or shy away from confrontation. Nora, on the other hand, was entirely different. Her words echoed in his mind, making him question just how prepared he really was for the months ahead. What was supposed to be a simple game was beginning to feel more like uncharted territory, and for the first time, Lucas wasn't entirely sure who was in control. 6 months is 6 months, Nora said with firm resolve, and I plan on walking away from this exactly as I entered. Lucas studied her closely, recognizing the sincerity in her voice. Nora wasn't someone looking for shortcuts to wealth or status, unlike others he'd encountered. She had no interest in using this marriage to climb the social ladder, which both surprised and intrigued him. "So, what do you want out of this, Nora?" Lucas asked, genuinely curious. "Freedom," she replied without missing a beat, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to understand that even though we're entering into this agreement, I won't be controlled by you. I have my own life, and that's not going to change just because of a temporary marriage." Lucas chuckled softly, more amused than offended. It wasn't the answer he expected, but it intrigued him nonetheless. He realized granting her that freedom wouldn't be a problem. After all, to him, this was merely a formal arrangement to win a bet. If Nora wanted to remain independent, so be it. "Fine," Lucas said with a casual shrug. 6 months. After that, We go our separate ways." Nora studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. She had accepted this challenge on her own terms, with a plan in mind, and she wasn't about to let Lucas derail it. Deep down, she suspected he might try to manipulate the situation, but she trusted her own strength and determination to hold her ground. The meeting ended on a surprisingly cordial note, with both of them leaving with a clear understanding of their roles. Nora would retain her independence, and Lucas would treat the marriage as nothing more than a business formality. Yet as the days passed and the wedding date loomed closer, Lucas found himself reflecting on the situation more than he cared to admit. The game, it seemed, wasn't as straightforward as he had imagined. The wedding itself was a cold, calculated affair, stripped of any sentimentality. To anyone watching, it looked more like the signing of a high-stakes contract than a celebration of love. Nora wore a simple, elegant dress, her expression calm and unreadable, while Lucas exuded his usual air of composed confidence. He already saw himself as the winner of the bet, certain that 6 months would fly by and that Nora, no matter how strong-willed, would eventually soften under the luxurious lifestyle he could offer her. After the ceremony, Lucas wasted no time in taking Nora to his penthouse, a sprawling, glass-walled marvel that overlooked the dazzling New York City skyline. As the elevator doors slid open to reveal the massive space, Nora stepped inside, her face giving nothing away. "Welcome home," Lucas said with a wry smile, gesturing to the lavish surroundings. The penthouse was immaculate, with modern furniture, high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city's glittering lights. Nora looked around, her expression neutral but thoughtful. "It's impressive," she admitted, her tone polite but detached. Lucas leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her. He expected her to be awed, maybe even overwhelmed by the grandeur, but Nora didn't seem fazed. If anything, she appeared as though she were assessing the space like a chessboard, calculating her next move. "I'm glad you approve," he said, his voice carrying a trace of sarcasm. "I imagine this is a step up from wherever you're used to living." Nora turned to him, meeting his gaze directly. "I agreed to 6 months," she reminded him calmly. "This place doesn't change that. Don't mistake my being here as anything more than part of the arrangement." Her words, though measured, struck a chord in Lucas. This wasn't going to be the simple game he had envisioned. Nora's independence and determination weren't just traits. They were weapons, and she wielded them with precision. As Lucas showed her around the penthouse, he couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and admiration. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and while he still saw the arrangement as a means to win the bet, a small part of him wondered if Nora might prove to be more than he'd bargained for. The penthouse stood as a monument to Lucas's wealth, a glittering palace of glass and steel overlooking the city below. The expansive windows reflected the skyline's shimmering lights, while the interiors boasted the most exclusive decor money could buy. To Lucas, this wasn't just a home, it was the battleground where he believed he would win. Through the overwhelming power of his material world, he was confident he could sway Nora into his orbit, as he had so many others before her. But Nora's resolve was unshakable. From the moment she stepped into the penthouse, she made her stance crystal clear. Her demeanor was distant, her sharp gaze taking in the space not with admiration, but with quiet defiance. She turned to Lucas, her expression cool and unreadable. 6 months. Lucas, she said firmly, her tone carrying a weight that was impossible to dismiss. Not a day more. Without waiting for his response, she strode over to the nearest window, looking out at the sprawling city beneath her. The sparkling skyline, the height, the grandeur, It was as though none of it mattered to her. She remained unmoved, a stark contrast to every other person Lucas had ever brought into his world. Lucas smirked, though inwardly he was slightly taken aback. He was used to resistance in the beginning, an initial reluctance that would always melt away in the face of his charm and the sheer force of his wealth. Nora, he told himself, would be no different. She couldn't be. In the days following their unceremonious wedding, Lucas launched into a full-scale campaign to impress her. He spared no expense, showering Nora with extravagant gifts, glittering jewelry, designer clothes, invitations to luxurious trips, all tokens meant to dazzle and draw her in. But Nora refused to bite. "I don't need these things, Lucas," she would say, her voice calm but firm, as she gently pushed aside yet another diamond necklace or declined yet another weekend retreat to some exotic destination. Her serene dismissal of his efforts wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. Lucas, who was used to having everything and everyone bend to his will, was seeing his authority tested for the first time in years. It wasn't just about the bet anymore. This was personal. Lucas didn't just want to win the wager, he wanted to win her. He needed to prove that, in the end, he was still the one in control. The shift in his tactics came subtly at first. He began to interfere with Nora's routine, undermining her independence in ways she hadn't expected. When she insisted on continuing her job, he tried to dissuade her. "You don't need a paycheck anymore," he said, his tone smooth but firm. "Your role as my wife is more important." When she refused to back down, he escalated. He began delaying her with manufactured scheduling conflicts, making her wait hours for meetings that never materialized. Lucas controlled every aspect of their shared time, twisting situations to remind her that, in this space, his space, he held all the power. But Nora was unyielding. Every attempt to dominate her was met with quiet resistance. She refused to give up her modest, independent lifestyle, refused to let go of the person she was before this arrangement. It was a quiet war of wills, and to Lucas's mounting frustration, he found himself losing more ground than he expected. Nora's calm defiance wasn't just an obstacle. It was a mirror reflecting his own insecurities. For the first time, he questioned whether all the money, power, and control he wielded could ever truly win over someone who valued none of it. Nora was an unyielding rock against Lucas's relentless attempts to assert control, and that resistance only fueled his desire to break her. Their relationship transformed into a tense battlefield where every interaction carried the potential for conflict. Small provocations surfaced in trivial conversations, only for Nora to dismantle them with sharp words and calm composure, deflating Lucas's efforts to make her feel inferior or submissive. On one particularly tense evening, Lucas decided to change tactics. They were seated in the expansive living room, the city skyline twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Lucas leaned forward, his frustration barely contained. "I don't understand you, Nora," he said, his voice edged with exasperation. "Any other woman would be thrilled to live this kind of life. They'd be grateful for all of this." He gestured to the opulent surroundings, the markers of his success. "But you act like none of it matters. What do you really want?" Nora, who had remained impassive throughout his rant, finally lifted her eyes to meet his. The intensity in her gaze caught Lucas off guard. It wasn't anger, but a sharp, piercing clarity that seemed to cut right through him. "What do I want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "I want respect, Lucas. I'm not a piece on your chessboard. You think you can control me with money, that you can dictate my life because you're wealthy. But you're wrong." She stood then, her words gaining momentum as she spoke, each one hitting like a well-aimed blow. "Money doesn't buy dignity. It doesn't buy integrity. You might have all these things around you, the luxury, the power, the control, but inside you're empty. And that's what you can't stand. You can't stand that none of this can fill the void." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. For the first time, Lucas felt something unravel inside him. She wasn't just resisting his power, she was pulling apart the facade he had spent years constructing. It terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate, exposing a vulnerability he hadn't acknowledged even to himself. But fear turned to defiance. Instead of backing down, Lucas decided to escalate. If charm and material indulgence couldn't break Nora, then strategy would. He began plotting ways to isolate her, believing that stripping away her support system would force her to rely on him. He cut off her connections, sabotaged her work opportunities, and closed doors she might have used to advance her career. Each move was calculated, designed to corner her into submission. Yet, no matter what Lucas did, Nora stood her ground. Every time he knocked her down, she came back stronger, her resolve unshaken. She carried herself with unrelenting dignity, refusing to be shaped or diminished by his games. Each act of defiance only deepened Lucas's frustration and his begrudging admiration. Then came the night when Nora shifted the balance entirely. It was late, the penthouse quiet except for the faint ticking of an ornate clock on the wall. Nora sat across from Lucas, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with determination. She leaned forward slightly, her voice measured and deliberate. "You think you're in control, don't you, Lucas?" she said, her tone laced with calculated confidence. "But here's the thing, you don't know the half of it." Lucas raised an eyebrow, masking his unease with a smirk. "And what exactly am I missing?" Nora smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I have a plan too," she said, her words deliberate, each one carrying an unspoken weight. "And when the time is right, you'll see. This game you think you're playing, it's built on something much bigger than you ever imagined." Her words hung in the air, leaving Lucas uncharacteristically silent. For the first time, the balance of power shifted, and Lucas, the master strategist, found himself blindsided. He realized, perhaps too late, that Nora was more than just an opponent. She was a player in her own right, one who had been several moves ahead all along. Lucas stared at Nora, his surprise evident for the first time. Her words lingered in the air, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. For the first time, a gnawing fear crept into his mind. Maybe he had underestimated her. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as in control of this game as he thought. The idea was foreign and deeply uncomfortable. Lucas Harper was always the one who won, always the one who dictated the terms. But with Nora, everything felt different. The weeks passed like a taut wire pulled to its breaking point, tension growing heavier with each passing day. Lucas, consumed by his obsession with maintaining control, tried every tactic he could think of to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Yet, no matter what he did, Nora remained unflinching. She was an immovable force, a fortress of calm and resilience that Lucas couldn't breach. Every attempt to exert his power only seemed to breach her inner strength. And yet, there was something Lucas couldn't deny. As time wore on, his perception of Nora began to shift. It wasn't just her resilience that he respected. It was something deeper, something more personal. She was doing what no one else had ever managed. She was disarming him, She wasn't impressed by his wealth, nor intimidated by his power. Instead, she was slowly, steadily, breaking through the armor he'd spent years constructing, leaving him vulnerable in ways he'd never allowed himself to be. The realization made him uneasy. For the first time, he found himself thinking of her not as a pawn in a bet or an adversary to outwit, but as a person, a complex, fascinating person he wanted to understand. This feeling was entirely new to him, and it left him confused, torn between his need for control and a growing curiosity he couldn't suppress. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Lucas found himself alone in the cavernous living room. The city lights twinkled beyond the towering windows, casting their usual glow over the penthouse. Once, that view had filled him with a sense of power and accomplishment. Now, it felt hollow, as though the lights only emphasized the emptiness inside him. He stood by the window, his reflection faintly visible against the backdrop of the city. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and for the first time, he wondered why he felt this way. Nora was just a woman he'd married for 6 months, a woman who was supposed to be a mere piece in a game he'd already planned to win. So why was she affecting him so deeply? Why did she linger in his thoughts long after their interactions? The truth was unsettling. Nora had stirred something in him. She was forcing him to confront feelings he'd buried long ago, emotions he'd never allowed himself to entertain. Lucas, who had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed and unemotional, found himself shaken, and the fact that she could see through him, past his wealth, his charm, his carefully constructed image, only made him feel more exposed. Meanwhile, Nora carried on with her routine, her demeanor as composed and confident as ever, but Lucas noticed a change. She seemed more distant, her movements purposeful yet detached, as if she were waiting for something. There was an invisible wall between them, one that Lucas didn't know how to break through. The harder he tried to understand her, the more it tormented him. Each night, as he replayed their interactions in his mind, he found himself grappling with emotions he couldn't name. Was it pride that kept him from reaching out to her? Or was it fear? Fear of losing control, fear of discovering that she held more power over him than he cared to admit. Whatever it was, it drew him in, pulling him closer to her despite himself. Nora was no longer just a participant in his game. She had become something much more. Someone who challenged him, unsettled him, and, against all odds, made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. "You're different," Ethan said, his tone laced with curiosity as he observed Lucas. They were seated in a sleek downtown restaurant, the kind Lucas usually chose for their casual dinners. Ethan, the same friend who had proposed the bet months ago, leaned back in his chair, swirling his wineglass. "Normally you'd have everything wrapped up by now, but it seems like this woman is challenging you in a way no one else ever has." Lucas forced a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. He hated that Ethan was right, hated even more that he didn't have a quick, dismissive retort. Instead, he remained silent, swirling his own drink as the weight of Ethan's words sank in. Something had shifted, and Lucas couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, Lucas returned to the penthouse with a determination he hadn't felt in weeks. He needed clarity, needed to remind himself that this was just a contract, a game he had agreed to play for 6 months, nothing more. Whatever emotions he was grappling with, they were a distraction, a weakness he had to eliminate. When he walked in, he found Nora curled up on the couch, engrossed in a book. The warm glow of a nearby lamp cast soft shadows across her face, and she appeared completely at ease, unaware of his presence. For a moment, Lucas hesitated, caught off guard by the simple serenity of the scene. But then he cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had become their norm. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Nora looked up, her expression calm as she marked her place in the book and set it aside. "Of course," she said, her tone steady, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Lucas sat across from her, the distance between them feeling more significant than the plush carpet or expensive furniture could explain. He searched for the right words, but the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Finally he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically raw. "What are we doing here, Nora?" he asked, his question hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. "This started as a game, a bet, but now I don't know what to think anymore." Nora's gaze softened, but her composure remained intact. She studied him for a moment before answering, her words deliberate and weighted. "I'm not playing, Lucas. I never was. And I'm never going to stop till we're no longer in Mr. Littman's canary from." Her response struck him harder than he expected. There was no malice in her tone, only calm honesty. "From the beginning, I accepted this marriage for reasons that go beyond you," she continued. "I don't care about the money or the control you think you have. I'm here for something bigger, and if you haven't realized that by now, maybe it's time to open your eyes." Lucas felt a tightness in his chest, as though her words had struck a place he didn't know existed. It wasn't just the admission that she had her own motives, it was the realization that he was still in the dark about what those motives were. Her confidence, her clarity, it all made him feel unmoored. His frustration bubbled to the surface. "I know you have your secrets, Nora," he said, his voice sharp but laced with something more vulnerable. "But what gets to me is this: the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control. And I hate that." Nora's expression didn't change. She leaned forward slightly, her tone steady as she replied. "Control, Lucas. That's what this has always been about for you, hasn't it? But maybe it's time you stop trying to control everything. Not everything in life can be manipulated or won." Her words hit their mark, leaving Lucas momentarily speechless. For the first time, he felt as though the walls he had built around himself were starting to crack. He didn't know what scared him more, losing control of the situation, or the possibility that he was losing control of himself. Lucas suddenly stood up, the weight of Nora's words crashing down on him with a force he couldn't contain. He paced the room, his movements restless, as though staying still would only intensify the storm raging inside him. Nora remained calm, her eyes following his every step. Her serenity in the face of his turmoil only unnerved him further. After a moment, she rose from the couch and walked toward him, stopping just inches away. Lucas felt his heart race as her presence filled the space between them. For once, he couldn't find the upper hand, couldn't summon the words to regain control. "Lucas," she began, her voice low and steady, almost tender. "This isn't about control. You've spent your whole life trying to dominate everything and everyone. But with me," she paused, her gaze unwavering, "with me, you'll have to learn that control isn't always the answer. Sometimes, things just need to be what they are." Her words struck something deep within him, a part of himself he wasn't ready to confront. When his eyes met hers, he felt a connection he couldn't explain, couldn't resist. It was as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing her, not as a challenge, not as a piece in a game, but as the complex, extraordinary woman she was. "So what do you want?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. The usual confidence in his tone had been replaced by something raw and uncertain. Nora's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile, a smile that sent a chill down his spine. "I want you to figure that out for yourself, Lucas," she said simply. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The quiet of the penthouse felt deafening, and Lucas stood frozen, replaying her words over and over in his mind. She had stripped away every defense he had, leaving him exposed in a way no one ever had before. In the days that followed, the distance between them seemed to grow. Nora maintained her calm composure, going about her routine as though nothing had changed. But for Lucas, everything had. He couldn't stop thinking about her words, her mysterious smile, the way she seemed to see right through him. It was maddening. And yet, in that growing distance, Lucas began to feel a strange closeness to her, as though understanding her was the only thing that mattered. Obsessed with uncovering Nora's true intentions, Lucas found himself slipping further from the man he used to be. He hated the lack of control, the way she unsettled him, but he couldn't deny that she was reshaping the way he saw the world. It terrified him. With the 6 months of their marriage nearly over, every day felt like an eternity. Lucas could hardly sleep, his mind consumed by the looming revelation he felt was just out of reach. Nora had become an enigma he couldn't solve, and that mystery drove him to the edge. Desperate for answers, Lucas hired private detectives to dig into her past. He pored over every detail, followed every lead, and left no stone unturned. Yet every investigation seemed to hit a dead end, as if Nora had anticipated his moves and carefully orchestrated her life to stay one step ahead. The more Lucas searched, the more he realized he was chasing a ghost. Each answer only led to more questions, and every piece of information he uncovered only deepened the mystery. It was as though Nora existed in a world of her own making, a world Lucas was desperate to enter, yet couldn't seem to find the door to. It was as if Nora had always been 2 steps ahead, controlling the game from the very beginning. Lucas could no longer deny it. Every move she made seemed calculated, deliberate, as though he had been following her plan all along. That realization haunted him, and the weight of his own powerlessness pressed heavily on his chest. One night, after a grueling business meeting, Lucas returned to the penthouse later than usual. As he stepped inside, he noticed the light on the balcony. There, seated in a calm and commanding pose, was Nora. She looked out over New York City like a queen surveying her empire, her silhouette illuminated by the city's glow. Something about her presence tonight felt different, more final. Lucas sensed that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment she would finally reveal what she had been hiding. But the thought of hearing the truth made his throat tighten. He walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the penthouse. Nora didn't turn to look at him right away. The air between them felt heavy, charged, as though they both knew that whatever unfolded tonight would change everything. "I need answers, Nora," Lucas said, his voice firm but strained. "I can't take this game anymore. You have to tell me the truth." Made gulf in different grace from her expression, a weight that made Lucas feel small for the first time in years. There was something dark and fierce in her expression, a weight that made Lucas feel small for the first time in years. He felt his sadness take his skin away. He thought to himself, "A pity it goes with the territory." "The truth?" Nora echoed, a bitter smile curving her lips as she crossed her arms. "Do you really want the truth?" Lucas nodded, his determination unwavering despite the growing tension that filled the space between them. He braced himself for her answer, thinking he was ready for whatever came next, but nothing could have prepared him for what she said. You have no idea who I am, do you? Nora began, her voice carrying a cold, sharp edge that sent a chill through him. You've spent your entire life seeing people as pawns on your chessboard, thinking you control everything and everyone. But this time, Lucas, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the start. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, each syllable tearing through the certainty he had always clung to. He felt his composure falter, his mind racing to comprehend what she was saying. He opened his mouth to speak, but Nora didn't give him the chance. Do you remember the name Richards? She continued, her voice cutting through his thoughts like a blade. Of course you don't. People like you never remember the lives you destroy. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine, and a flicker of recognition sparked in his mind. Richards. The name stirred something distant, something he had buried long ago. My father, Nora said, her voice laced with bitterness, owned a small company. It wasn't much, but it was everything to him. He poured his heart and soul into it, trying to keep it afloat. And then you came along. Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. You destroyed it, Lucas. You saw an opportunity to grow your empire, and you didn't care who got crushed in the process. My father lost everything. His business, his pride, his health. He died penniless because of you. Lucas's chest tightened as the weight of her revelations sank in. He tried to summon a defense, an explanation, anything to absolve himself, but his mind was blank. The certainty he had always carried, the belief that he was the master of his world, was crumbling before her. Nora took a step closer, her voice growing colder. I've been waiting for this moment, Lucas, waiting for you to realize that, for once, you're not the one pulling the strings. This entire arrangement, this marriage, was my way of showing you what it feels like to lose control, to be the pawn instead of the king. Lucas stood frozen, his breath shallow as her words echoed in his mind. Everything, the bet, the marriage, her defiance, it had all been part of her plan. He had spent months trying to unravel her secrets, only to find himself at the center of a game she had been orchestrating from the start. For the first time, Lucas Harper was truly powerless, and the truth of that left him reeling. Lucas stepped back, his eyes wide as his mind scrambled to make sense of what he had just heard. What? He stammered, confusion thick in his voice. What are you talking about? Nora took a deliberate step toward him, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain that made Lucas feel smaller than he ever had before. My father, Lucas, she said, her voice trembling but firm. He was an honest man, doing everything he could to support our family. Until you came along? Her words struck like a hammer, each one shattering the carefully crafted image Lucas had of himself. You took everything from him, she continued, her voice rising. You ruined him. He lost his business, his pride, his hope, and because of you, he lost his life. Nora paused, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She took a breath, trying to steady herself before delivering the words that would forever change Lucas's world. My father unalived himself, Lucas. Because of you. Because of your empire. Your success at any cost. The impact of her words hit Lucas like a physical blow, leaving him frozen in place. Memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. There had been so many deals, so many contracts, so many lives disrupted by his relentless ambition. He had always justified it as the cost of doing business. Faces, names, stories. They had blurred together in his climb to the top. But now, confronted by the raw pain in Nora's eyes, those forgotten casualties came rushing back. Wait, Nora, he began. his voice weak and desperate, but she cut him off with a sharp motion of her hand. "No," she shouted, her anger boiling over. "You don't get to interrupt me. You don't get to explain this away. You have no idea what you caused. It's not just about money, Lucas. It's about lives. You took my father from me, the only person I had in the world, while you thrived, while you sat in your penthouse, counting your millions. My mother and I were left with nothing. We sank into death and despair. We couldn't even afford to eat some nights." Lucas's chest tightened as guilt pressed down on him, heavier with each word she spoke. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, helpless, as her accusations rained down on him. "I planned everything," Nora continued, her tone now steadier but still laced with bitterness. "When I heard about your bet, I saw my chance. I approached you on purpose. I accepted the bet because I wanted you to feel even a fraction of what I've felt. I wanted you to know what it's like to be played, to be manipulated, to lose control." Lucas felt his body tremble. He had always prided himself on being the one in charge, the one who held all the power. He had believed he would always emerge victorious, no matter the odds. But now, the truth stared him in the face. The tables had turned, and he was no longer the player. He was the pawn. Nora, the woman he had underestimated from the start, was the one controlling the board. The realization left him shaken to his core. For the first time, Lucas Harper was truly powerless, and it terrified him. Lucas tried to speak, his voice trembling under the weight of what he had just learned. I didn't know. I didn't know it was you, or—" "No, Lucas!" Nora cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. She stepped closer until they were face to face, her eyes burning with righteous fury. "You never knew because you never cared. You destroyed lives without a second thought. You were so focused on winning, on climbing higher, that you never stopped to see the wreckage you left behind." Her words hit him like a hammer, each syllable pounding the weight of guilt deeper into his chest. "I'm not here to destroy you, Lucas," Nora continued, her voice quieter now, but laced with unshakable resolve. "I'm here to make sure you never forget. To make you feel the pain, the same pain you caused so many others. And that pain, Lucas, will haunt you for the rest of your life." The finality in her tone was suffocating. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a sentence. Lucas had spent his life shielding himself from consequences, always justifying his ruthless choices as the cost of success. But now, for the first time, he was forced to face the real human cost of his ambition, and it was unbearable. Nora stepped away from him, her gaze cold and unyielding. The silence that followed her words felt deafening, pressing down on Lucas like a physical weight. He stumbled backward, collapsing onto the couch. His legs gave out beneath him, and he sat there, speechless, staring into the emptiness of the room. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt suffocating, like a gilded cage closing in around him. Every word Nora had spoken echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. She had shattered the carefully constructed world he had built for himself, revealing the rot beneath the surface. The woman he had thought of as a pawn, a mere piece in his game, had turned out to be the one holding all the power, and she had flipped the entire board. For the first time, Lucas felt completely out of control. He didn't know what to do, how to react. He was a man who thrived on solutions, on strategies, but there was no path forward from here. Nothing he could say or do would erase the pain he had caused. Nora didn't give him time to recover. After delivering the truth about her family, their destruction, her father's decision, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Lucas alone with the crushing weight of his guilt. The air in the penthouse felt stifling, every corner of the space reminding him of what he had lost, of the emptiness he had created not just in his life, but in hers. Lucas sat motionless, staring blankly into the space where she had stood. He wanted to run after her, to beg for forgiveness, to try to explain the inexplicable. But no words came. How could he justify the unjustifiable? How could he apologize for something so cruel, something that had destroyed so many lives? In the days that followed, Nora became the living embodiment of his failure. She stayed in the penthouse, but ignored him completely, her presence a silent, damning reminder of the man he truly was. She moved past him as if he didn't exist, her indifference cutting deeper than any words could. Lucas felt invisible in his own home, his power rendered meaningless. The man who once commanded rooms, made deals, and shaped destinies now felt like nothing more than a shadow. And the worst part was, he knew he deserved it. At breakfast, Nora sat in silence, her presence a stark reminder of the chasm between them. She barely lifted her eyes as Lucas tried to speak, his words faltering and dying in the heavy air. The man who was used to commanding attention, who had always been the center of every room he entered, now found himself utterly invisible in his own home. The absence of her attention was unbearable. Nora spoke to the staff, carried on with her personal affairs, but when it came to Lucas, it was as if he didn't exist. The wall of indifference she had built was impenetrable, and the weight of her silence was slowly dismantling the identity Lucas had so carefully crafted. One morning, as she adjusted her coat by the door, preparing to leave, Lucas finally broke the unbearable quiet. "Nora?" he called, his voice tentative, almost pleading. "We need to talk." She stopped, her back still to him, her hands smoothing the fabric of her coat. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lucas waited, his heart racing, desperate for any response. Even anger would have been better than this crushing indifference. But she said nothing. Without turning around, she stepped out and gently closed the door behind her, leaving Lucas standing alone in the echo of her absence. The pain of being ignored by her, someone he was beginning to see as so much more than an adversary, was unfamiliar and excruciating. Lucas was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, to winning every game he played. But now, he was the one being controlled, manipulated, punished. Not through confrontation, but through silence and disdain. Each time she walked away from him, leaving him standing in that void, the feeling of powerlessness grew, and that was only the beginning. Nora's influence began seeping into other parts of his life, her quiet retaliation extending far beyond their shared space. At work, Lucas noticed that important meetings were being rescheduled without his knowledge. Business decisions he had made with his usual confidence were suddenly being questioned. Projects he had initiated, ones that had seemed unassailable, started failing inexplicably. Lucas couldn't prove it, but he knew this was Nora's doing. He could feel her hand in every disruption, every crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed empire. She was pulling the invisible strings that held his life together, dismantling his sense of control, piece by piece. At home, things were worse. Nora's disdain became deliberate, her distancing more pronounced. She stopped sitting with him at meals entirely, choosing instead to eat in solitude or with the staff. Conversations, when they happened at all, were curt and superficial. Every attempt Lucas made to reconcile, to repair the damage between them, was met with cold, unyielding rejection. When he followed her, desperate to explain himself, to apologize, she responded with nothing but icy stares. Her eyes carried the weight of her disdain, as if his very presence was an annoyance. Each rejection chipped away at him, leaving Lucas grappling with an unfamiliar and deeply unsettling reality. He was no longer in control. He was powerless against the woman who had once been a mere piece in his game, and the realization left him spiraling. For the first time in his life, Lucas Harper, the man who always won, was facing a battle he couldn't conquer, and it was destroying him. One night, Lucas found Nora sitting in the living room, a book resting in her hands. The scene looked serene, almost peaceful, but Lucas knew better. This moment of calm was a silent trap, one where his words would have to navigate a minefield of her disdain. He sank onto the couch, the weight of his desperation palpable. His voice, low and almost pleading, broke the silence. "Nora," he began, carefully choosing his words. "I know I've done horrible things. I know I've caused you pain, but please, can we try to work this out? Can we at least talk?" Nora slowly closed the book, her movements deliberated and unhurried. She didn't look at him at first, the air between them heavy with tension. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, her face was so devoid of warmth it sent a shiver down his spine. "Talk?" she repeated, her lips curling into a bitter smile that was colder than any silence she'd offered before. "You think there's something left to say? You want words, Lucas? After everything you've done, words are useless." Lucas swallowed hard, standing from the couch as a surge of desperation overtook him. He moved closer to her, his hands clenching as if trying to hold on to something tangible. "I was wrong, Nora. I know that," he insisted, his voice trembling. "I would do anything to fix what I've done. I can change. I swear, I can change." Nora stood slowly, her piercing gaze locking onto his as if daring him to prove his own promises. "Change?" she repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "Do you think changing now will erase everything? Will it bring my father back? Will it fix the years we spent in misery because of you?" Her words hit him like a blow, each one heavier than the last. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. She stepped closer, her intensity crushing him under its weight. "No, Lucas, it won't," she said firmly. Her voice was calm but carried the sharp edge of finality. "What you do now isn't for me, it's for you. You'll carry this weight, this guilt, for the rest of your life." Lucas stood frozen, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he realized there would be no easy redemption, no grand gesture that could undo the pain he had caused. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would not come easily. The path forward was uncharted and riddled with uncertainty. In the days that followed, Nora seemed to heighten her quiet punishments. Her looks of disdain became sharper, her silence heavier, her presence more unbearable. Lucas's frustration turned into desperation as he tried, in every way he could imagine, to show her he was changing. He left her thoughtful gestures, gave sincere apologies, and tried to prove himself through actions rather than words. But every attempt was met with indifference or biting sarcasm. One night, after returning home from a disastrous meeting where an important project had been mysteriously sabotaged, Lucas walked into the penthouse and froze. In the living room, Nora was on the phone, her laughter light and effortless in a way that felt like a dagger to Lucas's chest. He lingered in the hallway, unnoticed, catching fragments of her conversation. She spoke in a tone of casual amusement, but her words carried a familiar weight. It didn't take long for him to piece together the implications. She was discussing his decisions at work. She wasn't just punishing him at home. She was unraveling his world from every angle, dismantling his control, piece by calculated piece. Lucas's blood ran cold. The realization was inescapable. The woman he had once underestimated, the one he had tried to control, now held all the power. And she was using it with a precision that left him defenseless. Lucas knew without a doubt it was Nora. She was the force dismantling everything he had built, not with a dramatic, calculated precision, but with subtle, calculated precision. She orchestrated her revenge in a way only he could recognize, ensuring his suffering remained silent and unseen by others. It was cruelly brilliant, and it left him trapped, unable to prove her hand in the chaos. When Nora hung up the phone, Lucas was already in the living room, waiting. His expression was a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and pain. He stared at her, his emotions boiling under the surface. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but trembling with suppressed anger. "At work? Here? You're destroying my life." Nora's gaze remained impassive as she crossed her arms. Her calm, unreadable expression only stoked the fire in Lucas's chest. "Destroying your life," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not destroying anything, Lucas. I'm just giving back what you gave." "Don't worry," she added, her tone almost mocking. "I won't ruin you financially." That would be too simple, too merciful. Her eyes locked onto his, sharp and unyielding. "I want you to live with the pain. I want you to feel every small loss, every failure, just like I did. I want you to wake up every day and watch as everything you built crumbles, knowing it's your fault." Her words landed like a series of hammer blows. Lucas felt as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He had always been the winner, the one who held the strings of power and controlled the fates of others. Now he was the target, a pawn in someone else's game, and it was a game he had no idea how to win. Nora's revenge wasn't meant to destroy him in one catastrophic moment. It was designed to erode him slowly. Each calculated setback, every look of disdain, was a carefully placed stone in the wall of guilt and despair she was building around him. The realization left Lucas shaken to his core. Weeks passed, and Nora's quiet punishments continued. She ignored him at every opportunity, her indifference cutting deeper than words ever could. Lucas, once arrogant and self-assured, now wandered the penthouse like a ghost of his former self. His confidence had been stripped away, leaving him grasping for redemption he knew he could never earn. Every attempt to make amends fell short. He tried gestures of kindness, apologies, and efforts to change, but none of it seemed to matter. Lucas was trapped in a relentless cycle of guilt and pain, a cycle she controlled with chilling perfection. And yet the worst was still to come. One night, as Lucas sat slumped on the couch, utterly exhausted and broken, Nora approached him. Her footsteps were deliberate, her presence commanding. She stood over him, her expression colder than he had ever seen before. He looked up at her, searching for any trace of the woman who had once been an enigma, a challenge he thought he could overcome. But what he saw was someone who had transformed into a force he couldn't reckon with. "Hoswantres!" "Lucas," she began, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You took something from me that I can never get back." Her words hung in the silence, heavy and inescapable. "Now, I'm returning the favor." She leaned in slightly, her gaze piercing, her voice unwavering. "And you will live with that for the rest of your life." The weight of her words crushed Lucas further into the couch. They weren't spoken with anger or hatred. They were delivered with an eerie calm that made them all the more devastating. He realized, in that moment, that there was no forgiveness, no redemption. He was sentenced to a life of regret, trapped in the ruins of what he had built, haunted by the pain he had caused. And he knew that he deserved every moment of it. And, with those words, Nora left him there, her silence saying more than any argument ever could. She didn't need to say anything else. The punishment was already in motion, and Lucas knew there was no escape. He sat there, paralyzed, haunted by the weight of her words and the stark reality of what he had become. The confident, arrogant Lucas Marshall who once believed he controlled everything and everyone was gone. What remained was a man trapped in a labyrinth of guilt and despair. The weeks following Nora's revelation had been unbearable. Lucas no longer recognized himself. He had been reduced to a shadow, a hollow reflection of who he once was. Every attempt to speak with her was met with cold stares or complete indifference. Her rejection was devastating, but it was her silence that truly ate away at him. It was as if he had ceased to exist in her world. And that realization was suffocating. He barely slept, his nights consumed with thoughts of everything he had done wrong, everything he had lost. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for a way to fix what he had broken. But the weight of the truth was crushing, and the consequences of his actions seemed insurmountable. Still, something began to shift within Lucas. He realized that his words no longer held any value. Apologies, no matter how heartfelt, meant nothing without real, tangible change. Nora didn't need promises. She needed to see transformation. And, for the first time in his life, Lucas understood that it wasn't about winning her back. It was about becoming the kind of man who could even deserve forgiveness, whether she gave it or not. One morning, Lucas woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't erase the past, but he could start by respecting Nora's space, by showing her that he understood she needed time and freedom. Pressuring her with more words or gestures would only push her further away. Instead, he decided to act not in grandiose ways, but through small, meaningful gestures that demonstrated his sincerity. Lucas began to observe the details of Nora's life, the little things he had never paid attention to before. He noticed the way she favored flowers, peonies in particular. He caught the faint smile she gave when she smelled fresh coffee brewing in the morning, always strong and without sugar. These details, which once seemed insignificant, now felt like a lifeline, clues to who she was and what mattered to her. That same afternoon, Lucas visited one of the most renowned flower shops in town. He carefully selected a bouquet of soft, blush-colored peonies, their delicate petals reminiscent of the strength and resilience he now associated with Nora. But he knew he couldn't simply hand them to her. She would reject them outright, seeing the gesture as another hollow attempt to win her over. Instead, he decided to leave the flowers where she would find them naturally, without any pressure or expectation. It wasn't about her knowing they were from him. It was about showing he was paying attention, even if she didn't acknowledge it. Later that evening, as Nora returned home, she found the bouquet carefully placed on the kitchen counter, accompanied by a small note that read, "No words, just a reminder that I see you." Lucas didn't linger to see her reaction. He left the room before she arrived, giving her the space he knew she needed. For the first time, his actions weren't about control or manipulation. They were about showing her that he was willing to change, even if she never forgave him. It wasn't much, and Lucas knew it wasn't nearly enough, but it was a start, one small step toward rebuilding what he had destroyed, even if it could never be fully repaired. Instead of adding a note, Lucas left the flowers on the kitchen table, a simple but meaningful gesture. He didn't linger to see her reaction. Instead, he waited anxiously, glancing toward the kitchen from time to time as Nora went out for her usual walk. When she returned, he watched her carefully from the corner of his eye, trying not to be obvious. She stopped in front of the bouquet, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Lucas feared she might toss the flowers aside or ignore them completely, but instead, she reached out, picked up one of the blooms, and brought it to her nose. Her expression didn't change, but the small, deliberate act felt monumental to Lucas. She hadn't rejected the gesture outright. For him, it was progress. Encouraged by that subtle sign, Lucas continued with these quiet acts of thoughtfulness in the days that followed. Each morning he set the breakfast table carefully, brewing her coffee just the way she liked it, strong, with no sugar. He made sure to finish and leave before she entered the room, ensuring he wasn't imposing his presence. He left small touches, items she enjoyed, or little comforts she appreciated, where she could find them naturally, never forcing a meeting or a conversation. It was his way of showing her he was paying attention, that he understood the boundaries she had set and respected them. For Lucas, it wasn't about winning her over quickly. It was about proving that he was genuinely trying to change, even if it took time. But Nora remained guarded, the wall between them firmly intact. She acknowledged his gestures with quiet neutrality, never reacting with outright rejection, but never offering encouragement either. Lucas understood it would take time, and he was willing to wait. He was committed to proving himself, not through words, but through consistent, meaningful actions. On a particularly cold evening, something shifted. Nora was standing on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket as she gazed at the city lights. Lucas hesitated in the living room, holding a cup of tea he had prepared for her. For a moment, he considered leaving it on the counter and walking away, but something urged him to approach her directly. He stepped out onto the balcony, the cold air biting at his skin. "Here," he said softly, holding out the tea. "I thought you might like something warm." Nora didn't speak at first, her eyes remaining fixed on the city ahead. Then, without a word, she reached out and took the cup from him. The gesture was small, almost mechanical, but it felt significant. Lucas stayed beside her, careful not to push or demand anything from her. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel unbearable. It felt as though something was beginning to shift, even if it was barely noticeable. After a long pause, Nora finally spoke, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "Why are you doing this, Lucas?" Her question hung in the cold air, and Lucas felt his chest tighten. He turned his head slightly to look at her, choosing his words carefully. "Because I want to," he said quietly. "Because I need to. I'm not trying to fix what can't be fixed, Nora. I just want to show you that I'm trying to be better. For you, for me, for everything I got wrong." She didn't respond right away, her gaze still on the glittering city lights. But she didn't walk away either, and for Lucas, that was enough for now. Nora finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. The sound felt like a lifeline to Lucas, a rare crack in the wall she had built around herself. He knew this was his chance, but he also knew he needed to tread carefully. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Because I realized that talking doesn't mean anything anymore," he began, his tone calm and deliberate. "My words don't matter. What I did can't be fixed with apologies. But I'm trying to show you that I'm changing, not just for you, but because I need to. I want to be better, for both of us." Nora didn't respond immediately. She held her cup of tea, her gaze still on the glittering city below. The cold wind blew past them, but the tension between them seemed to ease, even if just slightly. After a few moments, she finally spoke, her voice quieter than he had expected. "You can't change the past, Lucas," she said, the softness in her tone surprising him. "I know," he replied sincerely, "but I can change the future." For the first time that night, Nora turned to look at him. Her gaze wasn't as cold as it had been. There was still a guardedness, but now there was also a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Maybe even the smallest sliver of hope. Lucas knew she wasn't ready to forgive him. not yet. But he also knew this was a pivotal moment. He had touched on something she might want to believe in, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. In the days that followed, Lucas continued with his small gestures, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them. Nora still kept her distance, but she wasn't as openly dismissive. She accepted the flowers he left for her, the cups of tea, and even began allowing brief conversations during breakfast. They were superficial exchanges, but they felt monumental to Lucas. The barriers were starting to come down, even if only brick by brick. The real test came one evening when Lucas was preparing to leave for a business meeting. He stood in the living room, adjusting his tie in the mirror, his mind already halfway in the boardroom. As he reached for his coat, Nora entered the room. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite decipher. "Can you cancel your meeting?" she asked suddenly. Lucas froze, staring at her in surprise. She had never shown any interest in his comings and goings, not since everything between them had fallen apart. He hesitated, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Cancel it?" he asked cautiously. She nodded, her face calm but unreadable. "Yes." Lucas didn't question her. He pulled out his phone and canceled the meeting without a second thought, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever the reason for her request, he wasn't about to miss the opportunity. As he set his phone down and turned back to her, he saw a subtle shift in her demeanor. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't walk away either. It was the first time in weeks that Nora seemed willing to spend time with him. Lucas knew better than to push. He would follow her lead and let her set the pace. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Lucas, that was more than enough to keep trying. They sat on the couch, a small distance between them. But for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It felt tentative, like the beginning of a bridge being built between them. Nora seemed thoughtful, her gaze drifting as if she were processing everything that had happened over the past few months. "I'm not ready to fully forgive you," she said at last, her voice calm but resolute. "But you're showing me something different. I see that you're trying, and maybe that's the beginning of something." Lucas felt his heart race at her words. He didn't dare speak too soon, knowing the fragility of this moment. He couldn't rush things. He couldn't demand more than she was willing to give. But those words, as cautious as they were enough to keep his hope alive. The road ahead was still long, and he would have to tread carefully. But for the first time, he felt that forgiveness, and perhaps even love, wasn't out of reach. The night continued peacefully. They talked about trivial things, unimportant, everyday topics that felt monumental in their simplicity. For Lucas, it was a victory. This wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was about the quiet rebuilding of something that had been broken. He was learning to be patient, to listen, and to respect the boundaries Nora had set. Nora, for her part, seemed less untouchable. The ice that had encased her for so long was beginning to melt, and while she still held herself guardedly, there were cracks in her walls. Lucas knew he couldn't afford to make the mistake of underestimating her again. She was strong, and her resilience demanded his respect. Yet, even in these small victories, a shadow loomed over them. Lucas could sense it, a lingering weight in the air, a piece of the puzzle Nora had yet to reveal. He knew she was holding something back, something significant. He didn't press her, but he braced himself for the moment when it would finally come to light. In the weeks that followed that quiet evening, Lucas found himself navigating the strange mix of tension and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of progress. Nora no longer treated him with the icy indifference that had once defined their interactions. She accepted his small gestures, engaged in brief conversations, and even seemed to enjoy the routines they were building together. But she still held back, as if testing him, waiting to see if his change was genuine. Lucas dedicated himself entirely to proving that he was different. He canceled work commitments, prioritizing his time at home over the empire he had once valued above all else. He made himself available for Nora, not to intrude, but to show her that he was present. Small gestures became their shared language. Lucas would make breakfast, ensuring her coffee was strong and just the way she liked it, and sometimes she would join him in the kitchen. In the evenings, they would sit together and talk about the day's small events, or even share quiet moments without words. These seemingly trivial routines became the foundation of something new, something fragile but hopeful. Still, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger loomed on the horizon. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he needed to be ready. For now, though, he focused on what mattered most, being patient, being present, and showing Nora, not with words, but with actions, that he was truly trying to become a better man. Slowly, the ice between them began to melt, and Lucas noticed a shift in Nora's demeanor. The disdain that once defined her every interaction with him had softened. She no longer seemed to hold him in outright contempt, and their conversations, though still cautious, began to feel more natural. Yet something lingered, an unease Lucas couldn't shake. Despite the progress, he felt there was something Nora was still holding back. She remained guarded, avoiding deeper conversations about their past or any discussions of the future. It was as if she was waiting for the right moment to speak, but that moment never seemed to come. Lucas didn't press her, knowing that doing so could undo all the fragile progress they had made. But the unspoken secret gnawed at him, his curiosity growing more insistent with each passing day. One quiet evening, as the rain tapped lightly against the windows of the penthouse, Lucas noticed a change in Nora. She was sitting on the couch, her posture tense, her gaze distant. She seemed more introspective, more lost in thought than usual. Lucas tried to ignore the rising tension, but the silence between them became unbearable. Finally, he broke it. "Nora?" he said, his voice low, almost fearful of what her response might be. "I know there's still something between us, something you haven't told me. I can feel it." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of acknowledgement. "Please," he added softly, "if there's something you're still holding back, I need to know." Nora remained silent for a moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided his gaze at first, her breathing steady but deliberate. The seconds stretched, and the weight of her silence felt almost unbearable. Lucas forced himself to be patient, understanding that this wasn't something he could force out of her. At last, she took a deep breath and looked at him. Her eyes held a mix of pain and resolve, a storm of emotions barely contained. "You're right, Lucas," she began, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. "I've been holding something back. Something I didn't think I could tell you. Not until now." Lucas's chest tightened. He could feel the air around him grow heavy, as though the room itself anticipated the gravity of what she was about to say. "You're right, Lucas," she began. "I don't think I can tell you. Not as a result for processing properly." Whatever it was, he knew it would change everything. He leaned forward slightly, bracing himself for the revelation while simultaneously dreading what he might hear. Nora straightened, her tone firm, but her expression raw with pain. "Do you remember the company you destroyed?" she asked. "The one my father managed?" Lucas nodded, unable to speak. He remembered the cold, calculated decision, the numbers on a spreadsheet that had once seemed so distant, so impersonal. That deal had been one of many steps in his climb to the top. "I told you that you destroyed my family," Nora continued, her voice trembling slightly but never breaking. "And that's true. You took everything from us, our livelihood, our stability, our pride. But that's not all you destroyed." Lucas's heart sank. Her words carried an ominous weight, one that hinted at a deeper pain, a loss he hadn't yet fully grasped. He remained silent, his breath caught in his throat, waiting for her to continue. She paused, her hands tightening in her lap as if she needed to steady herself. "Lucas," she said, her voice softer now but no less resolute, "you didn't just destroy a business or a family. You destroyed a life." Her eyes met his, unflinching and full of anguish. "My sister, she couldn't handle the pressure, the shame, the way everything fell apart after what you did. She took her own life." Her words struck him like a lightning bolt, leaving him stunned, speechless, paralyzed. Lucas felt his entire world shift, the weight of her revelation crushing him under its sheer force. This was more than guilt. This was devastation. He had thought he understood the consequences of his actions, but now he realized he had barely scratched the surface. What he had taken from Nora, from her family, was immeasurable. Nora's voice didn't waver as she delivered the final blow. "You didn't just ruin us, Lucas. You destroyed her. And now, every day, I live with that loss, and so will you." Lucas stared at Nora, her words echoing in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. He felt like the ground had vanished beneath him, leaving him suspended in disbelief and guilt. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling, laced with a mix of concern and desperation. Nora lowered her eyes, her hands trembling as she fought back the tears threatening to spill. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost a whisper, yet every word hit him like a hammer. "I was pregnant, Lucas." The words crushed him, robbing him of breath and leaving him reeling. He blinked, struggling to process what he had just heard. "What?" he whispered, his voice hollow, stunned. "I was pregnant at the time," Nora continued, her gaze fixed on the floor as if looking at him would shatter her. "When everything happened, when we lost everything, when my father was gone, the pressure, the stress of it all, I lost the baby." Lucas felt as if the entire world had collapsed around him. His chest tightened painfully, and it was a struggle just to draw a breath. The guilt that had already consumed him for weeks now grew tenfold, threatening to swallow him whole. This wasn't just about business deals, financial ruin, or even her father's death. He had destroyed a life he never even knew existed, a life that could have been. "Nora," he tried to speak, but his voice cracked, the weight of his emotions choking him. I didn't know. I never could have imagined." Nora finally looked up at him, and the tears she had been holding back streamed down her cheeks. Her face was marked with pain, but there was still an unshakable strength in her gaze that pierced through Lucas's despair. "No," she interrupted, her voice trembling with hurt and resentment. "You didn't know, Lucas, because you never cared to know. You destroyed lives and didn't even look at the people in your way. I lost my baby, and you—" Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "You went on with your life as if nothing had happened." Her words cut deeper than any knife could. Lucas felt his knees weaken, and he slumped into a nearby chair, unable to stand under the weight of what he had just heard. He wanted to say something, anything that could ease her pain, but he knew there were no words for this. Nothing could undo what had been done. I "I don't have the words," he finally managed to say, his voice raw and full of despair. He looked at her, his face etched with agony. "I know what I did is unforgivable, and I'll never forgive myself for it, but please, Nora, I would do anything to try and make this right. Anything." Nora stood silent, watching him for a long, heavy moment. Her tears had slowed, but the anguish in her eyes remained. The silence between them was suffocating, filled with unspoken emotions and the enormity of what had been revealed. Lucas waited, his heart pounding, desperate for any response, but he knew, deep down, that no matter what she said or did next, he would carry the weight of what he had done for the rest of his life. Lucas sat silently, the weight of everything Nora had shared pressing down on him like a heavy storm. He knew there was nothing he could say to undo the pain, nothing that could bring back the baby or erase the devastation he had caused. But he couldn't let this moment pass without trying to show her he was committed to change, not through words, but through actions. Finally, Nora took a deep breath, closing her eyes as if making a difficult internal decision. When she opened them again, her expression had shifted. The pain was still there, etched into her features, but there was something else, something Lucas couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't the pure anger and disdain he had come to expect. It felt like the faintest spark of possibility. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Lucas," she said, her voice steady but tinged with raw honesty. "What you did, what happened, was devastating. It changed everything." She paused, her gaze distant as though searching for the right words. Lucas waited, holding his breath. "But," she continued after a moment, "I can see that you're trying, and maybe there's a chance that one day I can find a way to move forward. But it won't be easy. It won't be quick." Her words carried both hope and caution, and Lucas nodded slowly, his emotions a mixture of relief and sorrow. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something he could hold on to, a starting point. He swallowed hard, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his tone resolute. "No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you that I've changed, that I can be someone you trust, someone you can maybe one day forgive." Nora studied him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, there was a hint of an opening. It wasn't an end to the pain or a sudden transformation in their relationship, but it was a beginning. "We'll see," she said softly. "We'll see if you can." The silence that followed was heavy, but for the first time, it wasn't suffocating. It carried with it a fragile kind of hope, a sense of possibilities yet to be determined. Nora stood up, her movements calm but deliberate. She walked toward the door, her back to Lucas, and left the room without another word. This time, though, Lucas didn't feel the same crushing despair as before. Her words lingered in his mind. "We'll see." It wasn't much, but it was enough to light a small flame of hope within him. He knew the journey ahead would be long and full of challenges, but at least now there was a path forward. The days that followed were transformative for Lucas. Every word Nora had spoken stayed with him, weighing heavily on his mind. Her pain, her loss, her resilience, all of it became a constant reminder of what he had done and what he needed to do. He could no longer hide from the consequences of his actions, but instead of sinking into regret, he chose to let his guilt fuel his determination to change. This wasn't just about winning Nora's love or forgiveness, it was about becoming a man worthy of respect. Not just hers, but the respect of all the people he had hurt throughout his ruthless career. He began to look at his life differently, questioning the choices that had brought him so much wealth, but at such a high human cost. Small steps turned into larger efforts. Lucas started reaching out to the people his business decisions had affected, looking for ways to make amends where he could. He began taking a closer look at his company's practices, dismantling the merciless strategies he had once prided himself on. It was a slow, grueling process, but it felt necessary. He knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time. But for the first time, he wasn't focused solely on achieving an outcome. He was focused on the process, on becoming a better man, regardless of whether Nora or anyone else ever acknowledged it. And that, he realized, was the most meaningful step he had taken yet. That morning, Lucas made a decision that would redefine his life. He wouldn't allow his past to condemn him forever. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could take meaningful steps to repair as much of the damage as possible. This wasn't just about earning Nora's forgiveness. It was about proving to her and to himself that he was capable of genuine change. The first step was to face the consequences head-on. Lucas began tracking down the families and individuals whose lives had been destroyed by his ruthless business dealings. His initial visit was to the family of a former competitor whose company he had crushed in an acquisition years ago. The address led him to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the lavish world he had built for himself. When Lucas knocked on the door, a man he didn't recognize answered. His face was weathered with time and hardship, his expression guarded. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable. Lucas had seen it in Nora, and now he saw it again, reflected back at him. "I'm Lucas Marshall," he began, his voice steady but filled with a sincerity he had only recently discovered within himself. "I'm here to apologize." The man stared at him for a long moment, his disbelief evident. "Apologize," he repeated, his voice tinged with bitterness. He laughed coldly. "And what's that going to change now?" "I can't change the past," Lucas replied firmly, "but I can try to help rebuild the future. I'm here to offer compensation, to take responsibility for what I destroyed." The man's reaction didn't soften immediately, but Lucas didn't expect it to. He understood that trust and forgiveness couldn't be bought or forced, but he was determined to try, regardless of the outcome. Over the next few weeks, Lucas dedicated himself entirely to this journey of redemption. He knocked on doors, met with families, and didn't shy away from the hard conversations that followed. Each interaction was humbling, a stark reminder of the human cost of his ambition. He didn't just offer financial compensation. He listened, he acknowledged their pain, and he began to truly understand the ripple effects of his choices. Beyond personal visits, Lucas began making broader efforts to rebuild what he had torn down. He donated large sums to small businesses that had been harmed by his corporate takeovers, establishing recovery programs to help struggling entrepreneurs rebuild. He partnered with local organizations to create sustainable opportunities for growth, using his resources not for his own gain, but to empower others. Nora watched from a distance, her cautious gaze following his every move. At first, she remained skeptical, wary of his motivations. She knew Lucas was trying to change, but she also knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. She needed to see more than words. She needed to see consistent action. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas's transformation became undeniable. He wasn't simply going through the motions or making hollow gestures. He was doing the hard, unglamorous work of facing his mistakes and making amends. Slowly but surely, he began to earn a different kind of respect, one based not on power or wealth, but on integrity and humility. Nora found herself feeling something she hadn't expected: admiration. Lucas was no longer the man she had married as part of a bet. He was becoming someone new, someone who was proving day by day that his words were no longer empty. While forgiveness still felt distant, Nora couldn't deny that Lucas was changing. And for the first time, she began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the future he was trying to build might be worth considering. One evening, Nora stood on the balcony gazing out at the city lights, as if searching for answers among the twinkling skyline. The cool night breeze brushed against her, but she remained still, lost in thought. Lucas quietly approached her from behind, having just returned from another of his reconciliation visits. His steps were measured, his presence less imposing than it once might have been. His expression carried a calmness and resolve that reflected months of effort and reflection. "How was it today?" Nora asked, her voice steady, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Lucas sighed deeply, the weight of the day evident in his exhale. "Tough," he admitted, leaning against the balcony railing beside her, "but necessary. Every conversation, every apology, it's a step toward becoming a better person. Not just for you, Nora. For me, too." Finally, Nora turned to face him. Her eyes searched his face, and what she saw was different from the man she had first met. The arrogance, the cold confidence, the calculated detachment. It was all gone. In its place was someone raw, someone striving, someone who had faced his flaws and was working to change. The hardness in her gaze, the anger she had clung to for so long, seemed to soften in that moment. For the first time, she truly believed that Lucas was no longer the man who had entered her life because of a cruel bet. He was someone fighting to be better, not just for her, but for himself. Someone who was willing to fight for them. "I can see that, Lucas," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, but still steady and firm. "And I want you to know that I'm ready to try. Maybe it's time we leave the past behind and build something new." Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him, one so profound that it left him momentarily speechless. He hadn't realized how desperately he had been waiting to hear those words until now. They meant more to him than he could have ever imagined. Nora was willing to give them a chance, not as a couple bound by a bet, but as two people who had endured pain and transformation and were ready to start anew. As the 6-month marriage agreement neared its end, something surprising began to happen. The cold, distant partnership that had defined the beginning of their arrangement began to thaw. Lucas and Nora found themselves growing closer, their conversations becoming less formal, less tense. They began sharing genuine moments of laughter, of connection. They rediscovered pieces of each other that had been hidden beneath layers of pain and anger. Slowly, love began to blossom, not the forced, contrived affection of their early days, but something real, heartfelt, and entirely unexpected. They were no longer two strangers trapped in an arrangement. They were two people rebuilding a foundation, not out of necessity, but out of choice. On the eve of the 6-month agreement's expiration, Lucas decided to take a bold step. He prepared a special dinner, putting thought into every detail, the dishes, the music, the atmosphere. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a moment that would define everything they had worked toward. He didn't know exactly how Nora would respond, but he knew one thing. He didn't want their journey to end there. As the candles flickered and the table was set, Lucas stood waiting, his heart pounding. Whatever happened next, he was ready to give it everything he had. During dinner, the soft glow of the candlelight reflected Lucas's nervousness as he spoke, his voice wavering slightly, despite the weight of his words. "Nora," he began, his hands fidgeting lightly on the edge of the table. "I know our agreement is almost over, but I don't want this to end. I don't want us to end." He took a breath, steadying himself, before continuing. "I've fallen in love with you, Nora. truly. And I want us to continue, but as a real couple. No bets, no games, just us." Nora looked at him, her surprise evident, but her heart warmed as his sincerity washed over her. She realized she felt something for him too, something that had quietly blossomed over the weeks they had spent rebuilding their connection. They had started as adversaries, tangled in pain and mistrust, but now they had grown into something more, something real. "I love you too, Lucas," Nora said, her voice gentle but steady. "And I want to try. I want to build something with you. But this time, as equals, as a real couple." In that moment, the weight of their past seemed to lift. For the first time, happiness felt within reach, pure and unburdened. They had overcome obstacles that once seemed insurmountable, and now they were ready to move forward together, united by love. Months later, their love deepened as they adjusted to their new life together. But Nora began to notice something different, small changes in her body that she couldn't ignore. Morning nausea, fatigue, things she wasn't accustomed to. A checkup confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was pregnant. When she told Lucas, his reaction was one of pure joy. He embraced her, laughing and crying simultaneously, overcome with emotion. "Everything we've been through," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "It all led us here, to this." The pain and heartache of their journey felt as though it had finally found meaning in this moment of renewal. They weren't just building a future for themselves. They were building a family. "I want to do this right this time," Lucas said, his tone fluttering with sadness. "I want to marry you again. Not because of a bet, not for any reason other than loving you and wanting to spend my life with you." Nora's smile was radiant, her tears of happiness mingling with his. "I want that too, Lucas," she replied. "This time, it'll be a real wedding, a fresh start." Their wedding was nothing like the cold, businesslike ceremony that had marked the beginning of their journey. This time it was intimate and heartfelt, attended by only a small circle of close friends and family. There was no superficial glamour, no rush dictated by deals or bets, just Lucas and Nora, united by a love they had both fought hard to earn. As they danced together at the end of the ceremony, the soft strains of music enveloping them, Nora rested her head on Lucas's chest. "Who would have thought?" she whispered with a smile. "It all started with a bet." Lucas smiled, holding her closer. "Who would have thought it'd be the best bet I ever made?" In that moment, surrounded by love, redemption, and hope, they were ready for the next chapter of their lives. Lucas knew the road ahead wasn't without challenges. He still had much to prove, not only to Nora, but to himself and to the people he had wronged in his past. But now, he had something to fight for. A life filled with purpose, alongside the woman he loved and the child they were about to welcome into the world. As they swayed together, Lucas silently vowed to be the man Nora deserved, and the father their child would need. Together they faced a future brimming with possibilities, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.